You know the saying, everyone makes mistakes. It's what you learn from them that matters. Well, try telling that to a game company after they nuke a franchise, lose millions of players, or accidentally become a meme for corporate greed. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, 10 mistakes game companies never recovered from. And number 10 is United Front Games trying to follow up Sleeping Dogs with Triad Wars. Alright. That we got Sleeping Dogs is a miracle all by itself. Never mind the fact it ended up being as good as it was. The story of that game's development is a long and winding road where it seemed like the project was dead in the water on multiple occasions. Originally conceived by Treyarch as Black Lotus, but Activision wanted to make it a true crime game, so they canceled that version, handed off the idea to the newly formed United Front Games. They worked on that project for years, but for whatever reason, Activision canceled the whole thing because of quality issues, and it would have all been over at that point, but somehow the team were able to secure a new publisher with Square Enix, and it was changed from being a true crime game to Sleeping Dogs. And it was so much better than it had any right to be. I don't know what Activision was thinking regarding quality issues, but they weren't thinking. That's what it was. They're morons, Activision. Obviously not everyone there, but sometimes you really wonder with them. This was a promising start to an open world franchise that came out well before open world fatigue started settling in. In fact, arguably, had there been more Sleeping Dogs games, maybe it wouldn't have. They could have easily followed the game up with a bigger and better sequel, which to their credit was the original plan, but was scrapped in late 2013 before full production started. So what did they do instead? They made Triad Wars, a massively multiplayer online game in the same map as the original Sleeping Dogs. Not what fans of the original wanted, or anyone. Yeah, nobody wanted it. A crime game themed MMO could be interesting, but everything about Triad Wars looked cheap and thin on the ground. It looked like it was going to be another APB. Really big disappointment, and who could have saw that coming? That's what happened. The beta was not well received. United Front closed the whole thing in January 2016. Another huge disappointment is the fact that, by volume, very few of you are actually subscribed to this channel. It's bad for you guys, it's bad for us, because in all seriousness, subscribers keep this channel going. But yeah, back to United Front. They tried to follow up that massive blunder with another online multiplayer game that nobody remembers called Smash and Grab. I actually genuinely don't remember Smash and Grab. I have no idea what that is. And the damage was done, and the studio closed for good on October 17th, 2016. Why didn't they just make the Sleeping Dogs sequel? That was a game with strong word of mouth, it was relatively popular, and one of the few credible competitors to Grand Theft Auto. A sequel could have been huge, but for whatever reason, they gave up their ambitious plans for a follow-up to make Triad Wars, a game that literally no one wanted. And I'm not saying, like, in the lead-up, no one expressed interest. I mean, there isn't anybody on the planet who wanted that game. It did not sell, no one played it. Everyone thought that was going to be a failure, and that's exactly what it was. And number 9 is Starbreeze, insider trading, and of course The Walking Dead. Anybody remember the old Starbreeze? The guys who made some killer games like Chronicles of Riddick, Escape from Butcher Bay, and The Darkness? I would forgive you for assuming that the Starbreeze that made those games was the same Starbreeze that currently does the Payday games, because they have the name and are still essentially the same Swedish game company, but the truth is a lot more complicated, let's say. Starbreeze made Syndicate for EA. That game performed poorly, and the studio was struggling to keep the lights on. Overkill, another Swedish developer that made the first Payday, was also struggling at the time, so the plan was to merge the two companies. In 2012, it was reported Starbreeze had acquired the smaller Overkill, but in reality, it was the opposite. Overkill took over Starbreeze and eventually canned the original development team, so it was just Overkill left. This is where it starts, because things were looking grim for them, and they managed to bounce back with Payday 2, which ended up being a smash hit, and that's what's keeping the studio on life support to this day. Like, okay, rather than capitalizing on the success of Payday 2, though, the studio had made, frankly, many baffling decisions. They obtained the rights to The Walking Dead while that franchise was relatively popular, which makes sense. But then they obtained the proprietary Valhalla game engine and forced the developers to use that to make the game when the engine was barely functional. They started publishing really forgettable games like Raid World War II and investing heavily in virtual reality. While all this was going on, their Walking Dead project was an absolute mess, and even when they switched to Unreal Engine after 2 years of work, they weren't able to get that project together. The game was ultimately a disaster. It's a buggy piece of crap, tanked in sales, so Starbreeze filed for reconstruction with the CEO stepping down. A whole lot of confusing financial stuff went down, which led to Starbreeze getting raided. Like, the offices had Swedish authorities burst into them and arrested the CEO and the company's former CFO on charges of insider trading. It's real easy to get lost in the weeds with this one. The whole situation is an absolute clusterfuck. Even if both the CEO and CFO were eventually acquitted of all charges, Starbreeze managed to survive the restructuring process, and they went on to make more games, like Payday 3, which is a whole big mess at launch, nearly killed the company. I mean, it's better now, but Payday 2 is still their one profitable game, and they're still making DLC for it. That's really all they have. Every attempt to do something new hasn't worked for them, and it's hard to say if they'll ever recover from all their many, many bad decisions. And number 8 is Creative Assembly, Hyenas. Alien Isolation was a really big swing for Creative Assembly. These guys are known for the Total War games, which were grand strategy RTS titles and not cinematic horror, but they managed to make something real good with Isolation. It both honored the source material and did something new. Just a great game. Didn't make them a lot of money, though, and that's what they wanted for their next not Total War title. The game that would become Hyenas was greenlit in 2017. It went on to become what is claimed by anonymous developers as Sega's biggest budget game ever, which doesn't exactly narrow down how much the game cost to develop, but apparently in 2021, Sega said they were willing to invest up to $882 million into the game. Obviously, that is not what happened, but if the anonymous claims are to be believed, that means they pumped at least $70 million into it. A project that, let me remind you, was canceled in 2023. The entire thing was just tossed in the bin after some pretty negative beta feedback. A lot of people found the game's aesthetic annoying, and the extraction shooter gameplay was unimpressive. The anonymous developers weren't very happy with the overall direction of the project either, claiming that management was asleep at the wheel and the project was rudderless for years, which seems to be a common problem with these big live service projects. I think that people who wear suits and ties think they're money buttons, and all of that shit that happens in between let's make a money button and releasing a game, just it doesn't need to happen, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, because of the failure of Hyenas, a lot of employees were laid off from Creative Assembly, and generally it seems like the studio has struggled to bounce back after this major setback. It's not like the studio wasn't already struggling while developing Hyenas. It was resentment growing within the Total War community for years for their constant nickel and diming with the DLCs that cost a lot, didn't add much to the game, and the buggy game releases, just generally poor feedback in general. The studio's at least tried to address some of those concerns recently because they don't want to strangle the golden goose. Total War has to remain profitable to keep the lights on, but at this point it's hard to say if they'll ever bounce back to being one of the preeminent game development studios that they once were. And number 7 is Crytek's aggressive expansion. Crytek was on top of the world with the original Crysis. It was the PC game to get from 2007 to 2011 or so. It was cutting edge for years, and the "can it run Crysis" meme managed to stay relevant for a really, really long time. The Cry engine was getting licensed all over the place, and the studio was just rolling in accolades. Using this newfound prestige and cash, they proceeded to rapidly expand by buying up development studios left and right. In 2008, they purchased Black Sea Studios, and then they opened an office in South Korea. Then in 2009, they bought Free Radical, the Time Splitters guys, and renamed them Crytek UK. Makes a certain degree of business sense, I guess. And then for some inexplicable reason, they purchased the Homefront franchise from THQ and announced a new cloud-based social gaming network called GFace The spending spree had just gone off the rails at this point. By 2014, they were missing wage payments for their US-based employees, the same employees who went on to make a game that will eventually become Hunt Showdown, the one game in the Crytek library that's still making the money these days. It's been mostly downhill otherwise for them. Sometimes you get a noteworthy game using the Crytek engine like Kingdom Come Deliverance, but most developers just use Unreal. A lot of the studios and offices they opened back in the day also closed. And in 2025, they had ambitious comeback plans, but they were scuttled. Crysis 4 was put on indefinite hold, and the studio was hit with more layoffs. So Crytek is still holding, mostly kept afloat by Hunt Showdown, but otherwise it's a shadow of what it once was. They expanded too fast and too hard and never actually capitalized on that expansion. Just a lot of time and money wasted for no real benefit. I mean, I don't know why everybody doesn't learn this lesson. Don't expand crazy fast. Like, everybody who does it dies. And it seems like people still keep trying to do it. I don't get it, but whatever. And number 6 is Sega's Saturn rollout. You can't have a list like this and not mention Sega. I mean, at one point, they were, beating Nintendo. They did what Nintendo didn't, if you recall. But make no mistake, the Genesis was a serious threat to the Nintendo at the time, and it wasn't a passive rivalry. Sega was an existential threat to the dominance of Nintendo. They could have followed up Genesis with something incredible, kept that momentum going into the next generation, but instead they just completely botched it with confusing add-on consoles and baffling decisions. Sega's fall from the top partially came from Sony PlayStation honing in on their market, but so many of the problems that plagued Sega are just self-inflicted. There is, of course, the baffling decision to make the North American release of the Sega Saturn a surprise. The original planned release date was September 2nd, 1995, but Sega of Japan got scared they'd have to directly compete with Sony PlayStation, which was coming out around the same time. So instead, they did the completely rational thing and revealed the console was available to purchase now at their E3 1995 presentation. You know when E3 usually is, early summer, not exactly console buying season. Man, did it backfire. Stores were just pissed off, the gaming public was confused, and the initial release slate of games was, threadbare. The bizarre thing about the Saturn is that for whatever reason, Sega really wanted to capture the Japanese market at the expense of everyone else. With the Genesis, it was actually less successful in Japan compared to other territories, but instead of leaning into their international fan base, Sega of Japan was laser focused on winning over the significantly smaller Japanese gaming audience with the Saturn. It worked, and the Saturn was actually a big success in its home country. But in every other country, the rest of the world, all other markets, including the largest game market, the United States, it flopped. It flopped in those markets. And that was just one of the mistakes they made. The console was more expensive than the PlayStation. It had less impressive 3D graphic capabilities, to the point where it was rumored to not have 3D graphic capabilities. Sega basically had to make a tech demo game in Nights, which Nights is actually a really fun game, but it was entirely to show everyone that it could do 3D. But then there's the 32X and the Sega CD, which they were just throwing at people randomly in the United States. They tried to get things back on track with the launch of the Dreamcast, which is often considered one of the greatest gaming consoles of all time. Some of the most creative games ever made for this thing, but the damage was already done. Sega was in such dire financial straits, they probably could have had a mega hit with the Dreamcast. It was a moderate hit, to be frank, but they could have done 10 times as much, and it wouldn't have saved them because they were already so far underwater. They had to get bought out by Sammy to save them, and while Sega's obviously alive to this day and actually doing pretty well as a third-party publisher, that doesn't stop it from being a shadow of its former self. Like I said, these people were actually an existential threat to Nintendo at one point. And number 5 is BioWare's Anthem. This legendary studio is still around and apparently working on other things, a follow-up to their fan-favorite Mass Effect series, but it's hard not to look at them and think the writing's on the walls. It's just been one failure after another with these guys, starting with Mass Effect Andromeda, then of course Anthem, and then the underwhelming Dragon Age The Veilguard. With no more Dragon Age games in the future and the studio losing talent left and right, it feels like the possibility of a Mass Effect 4 actually coming out and being a satisfying follow-up, it's pretty low. The thing with BioWare is that their problems go back way further than Anthem. Dragon Age Inquisition was a contentious game, actually. And Mass Effect 3 was so extremely controversial that they had to change the game's ending, like months after release. Andromeda, of course, was a boring mess, but Anthem was supposed to be a clean slate. It was something new, a second chance for the studio to show the world they could do something free of the baggage of pre-established franchises. It was their make-or-break moment, and they broke it hard. The story of the development of Anthem, it's a long one, with all the usual executive indifference, poor planning, general directionlessness, and a whole lot of crunch at the last minute. The game was supposed to be saved by BioWare magic when the game could just come together at the end and actually be good, but that didn't happen. I mean, it was a live service game with barely any services. I guess it was live technically, but that's not enough. It was really hollow and empty in a way previous BioWare games, even the worst BioWare games, just weren't. That game flopped, the planned content was canned, the promised Anthem 2.0 overhaul was just flat out canceled, the whole thing was abandoned, and what remained of BioWare was shuffled off to make the next Dragon Age game, which was also planned to be a live service thing, which they did manage to turn into a more standard single-player game, which was not as bad as everybody said it was, but the live service stink still lingered. At time of writing, BioWare is still a functioning studio, but who knows how much longer it's got left. It's just been one failure after another for these guys, and while I would love to be proven wrong with a Mass Effect 4 that's a big true return to form, I will be surprised. And number 4 is Level 5's Yokai Watch 3. For a while, Level 5 was one of the essential Japanese studios. They made some of the all-time great PlayStation 2 classics like Dark Cloud and Dragon Quest, and they were responsible for, the Professor Layton games, Ni no Kuni, which is a game they made in conjunction with Ghibli. These guys were a big deal until at some point they just weren't anymore. Well, here in the West, they basically just disappeared overnight. The games still come out, but nobody cares. That's not actually true. 2025 is a more noteworthy year for the company with the Switch 2 launch, bringing out some of their bigger hitters, kind of a reminder of what was once. But their recent output has been a lot less popular, and it's not as nearly as critically praised as their old stuff. Under Sony and Square Enix, they were making some of the biggest games of their generation, but after striking it out on their own, they've become increasingly obsessed with franchise building above all else. And they've been cranking out games at a frankly absurd rate. Usually as the years go by, a developer's output decreases, but with these guys, they keep making more and more games that most people just don't care about, period. In 2013, Japan got the first Yokai Watch game, a completely shameless attempt at getting some Pokemon cash, and for a little while it worked. It was a full-on multimedia project, too, with an anime and a manga and a separate mobile game in Japan, and eventually America, where it came out 2 years later. The series managed to do pretty well, hitting peak sales of more than 7 million units with the second game, but by the third game, that number took a huge drop, and with the third game, they only sold about 2 million copies, which is a lot less than 7. Certainly, if I made a game and it sold 2 million copies, that'd be crazy. That'd be life-changing money for me individually, but for a company? So why did the numbers drop so precipitously? Well, probably because 2013 and 2017, and I'm not joking here, there were 9 Yokai Watch games, and I'm not even counting the different Pokemon-style versions of each game here. They were just saturating the market here like madmen. It was way too much, was way too fast, and it failed miserably. They just kept trying to make more yokai games, but the interest just was not there. And that didn't even stop them from trying to make new franchises like Snack World in 2018, and that was made alongside an anime. But the quality just wasn't there, though. They were more interested in just throwing whatever at the wall and seeing what sticks. Actually making good games was secondary to their goals, and it was blatantly obvious at this point that they just had no idea what they were doing with any of this crap. The thing about Level 5 is that they have the potential to make great games, but their seemingly endless desire to make a franchise that's profitable, that just seems to be their priority. If they can't just slow down and try to make something good that stands out, I don't see them ever matching their glory days on the PlayStation 2 and the DS. And hell, there could be ruin in their future based on what is honestly just nonsense. Do you know how much less you have to spend to make one game than 40? And one game that's really good, which they're entirely capable of doing, could make them significantly more money than any one of these random scattershot games. Which, by the way, some of them don't make money. And number 3 is Silicon Knights, two human that debacle. There's a Reddit post from a few years back that sums up Silicon Knights better than anything I can say. They were the masters of shooting themselves in the foot. Now, they managed to make some good stuff despite that, like the original Legacy of Kain Blood Omen. Their partnership with Nintendo produced stuff like Eternal Darkness and Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes, which are both highly polished games, some of the best on GameCube, honestly. After Dennis Didac and Silicon Knights ended their Nintendo deal and moved department over to the Xbox 360, that's when stuff just started falling apart. I mean, walking away from Nintendo was just a bad idea in the first place. If you've got a job at Nintendo, you've got a job for life. But they thought the Wii was going to be the kiss of death, so they bounced, which until the Nintendo Wii was the, at least for units sold, most selling console of all time. I don't know about most profitable in terms of hardware, I really can't tell you. But man, did they sell a lot of Wiis. But now they were free to work on the long gestating 2 Human project, and, well, the rest is history. They licensed Unreal Engine 3 from Epic, but eventually grew disillusioned with it, and eventually sued Epic for a breach of contract, saying Silicon Knights was giving an intentionally incomplete version of the engine, which maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but the big screw-up was discovered when Epic countersued for breach of contract and copyright infringement because Silicon Knights blatantly reused Unreal Engine 3 code when making their own engine for 2 Human. The same engine they were suing Epic over, saying it wasn't good enough, they were actually still just using in a blatant breach of contract. According to the judge, there were thousands of lines of Epic Games copyrighted code in the 2 Human engine, and the Silicon Knights developers attempted to disguise the code as their own. This wasn't a case where some code was used by mistake or anything. They even left the reference notes from Epic coders in there, so the theft was obvious, despite their half-assed attempts to cover it up. No, I'm not Mr. Intellectual Property. You won't see me rallying for intellectual property anytime soon. But I know what the law is, and I know how not to get screwed by the law. It's not doing this. Like, that's literally all you just don't use stuff that you can't, legally speaking. I mean, you can, obviously. They did. Whatever. Silicon Knights staggered along for 2 more years and eventually closed their doors in 2014. And number 2 is THQ's UDraw game tablet. THQ was never up there with guys like Activision or EA, but they were still one of the most noteworthy publishers for the late 90s and 2000s. They put out the Red Faction games, the Saints Row games, and the Darksiders franchise, among many other things. They made some serious missteps along the way that eventually led them to close their doors in 2013. The publisher suffered multiple setbacks in the early 2010s, and they made a lot of mistakes. By far the biggest blunder was the UDraw game tablet. It was a big push into kids gaming, and while the product was met with a certain degree of success when it launched for the Wii, their attempts to expand the reach of the device by releasing it for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 really backfired. They were stuck with around 1.4 million unsold units, and at least around $100 million went down the tubes on this one. The thing about UDraw is it didn't get a ton of hate online or anything. Impressions from the gaming press were actually generally positive. It's just that nobody wanted it in the numbers that THQ produced them. As a peripheral for the Wii, it makes sense, but it is completely incompatible with the audiences for the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. No one cared. It did not sell at all. The failure of the UDraw, combined with poor sales of a lot of their recent games, led to the game company being sold off for parts. Eventually, all these old franchises were mostly acquired by THQ Nordic, a separate entity which had acquired the THQ name. So while a few of these franchises are getting new games, like Darksiders, it's finally giving us the resolution of the original game's cliffhanger. That's nice. But the new THQ has nothing to do with the old one. They're dead and buried, and I mean, the cause was death by 1,000 cuts. The UDraw, that was the big cut, though. It was death by 1,000 cuts, and then a big cut. It was that cut, specifically. Could have survived that cut, if not for the 1,000 other small cuts, though. So... And finally, at number 1, Interactive Studios and Hasbro Interactive. Hint: the mistake isn't that they made Glover. Anybody remember Glover? If you're old enough, you might recall renting this thing for the Nintendo 64 back in 1998 and giving up on the first level because of the awful controls. If you can't tell, I can clearly remember it. But the game actually managed to sell pretty well despite the rancid online reputation. Them making this game, which is subpar at best, isn't the mistake because the initial sales numbers were good. They were even planning on making a sequel that possibly could have even improved on the shaky foundation of the original. I don't know if I believe that it would have, but anything's possible. We're talking about a hypothetical world that didn't happen here, a timeline we did not go down. So the sales, they were good enough to justify a sequel, though. Only there was one little problem. Hasbro screwed up. This is all according to a programmer's blog from back in 2015, so it's not perfectly verified, but it sounds fairly legit. The deal was that to make games for the Nintendo 64, third-party publishers had to order the carts from Nintendo, which is not cheap. The standard production run was 150,000 units, which is just about what the game ended up selling, and was the recommended number of carts for them to order. But what happened was, Nintendo was running a special on Nintendo 64 carts, so somebody at Hasbro ordered double the usual number of units to get a slight discount on the carts, which means that the game only having sold 150,000 copies, they were stuck with 150,000 more, which, keep in mind, they were advised to order 150,000 by Nintendo, who was selling them and was obviously the people who were making the money. Nintendo, who made more money on the 300,000 cart deal. Obviously, they advised them not to do that. Hasbro lost a bunch of money in the long run. All because some manager thought they were getting a deal on cartridges. They managed to make a game that would have been profitable and made it a huge failure. Regardless of the game itself, would have been profitable, could have been something. The studio survived and managed to keep hanging on until 2013, but most of their catalog ended up being pretty forgettable licensed games. It's a sad fate when your most noteworthy games are Dead to Rights Retribution and Epic Mickey 2, which not as good as Epic Mickey 1. But what's even sadder is that Glover is actually probably their best game, at least the most memorable of their games. And that's all for today. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. Best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription, so click subscribe. Don't forget to enable notifications, and as always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter @FalconTheHero. We'll see you next time right here on GameRanx.